Hello everyone and welcome to Princess Live. This afternoon you are in for a real treat as we have an expert in whiskies for your enrichment program. So please welcome to the stage Mark Southon.
Thanks for the intro. Good afternoon, everybody. I always start these things off. I know it's on a sea day today, so I know the weather's not been the best in the world so far, so hopefully no one's using this as an excuse to come in from outside and nod off for the next half hour or so. But what I'd like to do is just kick off by checking who's in the room, and there's no right or wrong answers to this. So just a quick show of hands, bit of audience precipitation, as I like to call it. So hands up if you're a whiskey drinker, please. That's the majority. Okay. Keep your hands up if you've ever visited a Scottish whiskey distillery. Yeah, a few. Okay, that's good. And finally, a show of hands. Who can remember as a child having a fever or the flu or something and then having a grandparent or an uncle or even a parent giving you a hot toddy and thinking, goodness gracious me, I will never touch this stuff again as long as I live? I love a challenge. Okay, right. Now, as I said, there is no right or wrong answers to any of those questions. And what I'm not going to do here this afternoon is tell you how to drink whiskey, what you should drink, how it should taste. That is purely subjective. It's down to you. Hopefully, you don't even have to be a whiskey drinker to appreciate and understand what we're going to be doing for the next half hour. So what I'm going to do, I've got 2 talks today and 2 more talks on the other sea days. Today is really all about the history and the provenance behind Scotch whisky and why the industry is where it is today. My second talk later on this afternoon is really the people that have moulded the industry into what it is today from when it was a medieval industry back 500 years ago to what is now a £5 billion export in sterling for the UK. It's pretty mind-bending. That translates to the sale of 40 bottles per second in over 172 markets around the world. And you can see the other thing from the modern era here. You've got this lovely old Victorian photo here, top right, okay? And if you look down to the bottom right-hand picture here, what you've got is just one seat in a distillery there where it's all being controlled in one room. So some of the romance, you could argue, has gone out of it. But yeah, so modern technology is in there, but it really is something of old tradition. So to kick off then, some simple definitions. What is Scotch? Well, for the champagne drinkers in the room who likes their sparkling wine, obviously for champagne to be called champagne, it has to be the sparkling wine that's come from the Champagne region of France. Similarly with Scotch, it's not rocket science. Scotch is whiskey that has been produced in Scotland and aged in oak barrels for a minimum of 3 years. Now, what is whiskey? So this is the one bit of chemistry you're going to get this afternoon from me. Spirit which has been produced by the distillation of a mix or a mash, if you will, a recipe of cereals, usually barley, in the case of single malt whiskey, which is the one that you might be more familiar with. And that whiskey, that barley in turn has had its energy source for it to grow, the starches inside the plant, converted by the action of enzymes into sugars, which in turn are then fermented by the action of yeast to produce the A word, yeah? Alcohol. Okay, which goes with it. So you can blame the ancient Greeks or applaud the ancient Greeks for a lot of things, and distillation is one of them. The ancient Greek sailors were the first to evaporate drinking water from seawater, and indeed the word itself comes from the Latin verb destillare, literally to drip down. Okay? So you have the ancient Egyptians practicing distillation for cosmetic purposes. They had very strong links with what would have been the alchemists of this day, trying to extract things like sulfur, mercury, arsenic, to change the outer appearance of base metals into gold. So a very close link back with the scientists of the day. You move forward to the 6th century, and we have records of Persian medics producing herbal tinctures by distillation at Jundishpa Medical School. And if you go further 400 years, and those of you that have been to a distillery, you'll hear when they talk about distilling, and it's coming up on the next slide as well, often references to the Arab Moors. Okay, so in the 9th and 10th centuries, you've got evidence of the Moors using large, elaborate stills to produce what would have been then rose water and other herbal compounds. Now, what was coming off of these ancient stills was not practiced for drinking enjoyment. They had a greater religious significance. It was known that spirits were able to preserve human flesh. So there was notions of longevity or immortality even, if you actually drank the stuff. If you ever in a room with a Scotsman and he says to you, and I'm sorry, I am English, so apologies for my accent, but if he says, aye, well, you know, we invented the stuff, right? He's probably telling you porkies, because pork pies, he's lying to you, because it really isn't quite telling the truth. The Irish monks, as early as the 6th century, St. Columba, in this illustration here, set sail and landed on the Kintyre Peninsula, which we would have rounded in the late hours of thinking last evening, before actually settling on the Isle of Iona. Any of you that have visited the Hebrides, the west side of Scotland before, famous old monastery and monastic links to Iona. And these monks, in turn, would have been the ones who would have gone on to have learnt distilling, as I said, from the Arab Moors. You move forward to the 12th century, and you've got the monks returning from Western Europe, having learned and adapted the art of distilling from these Moors. Also at that time, bearing in mind that these were monks, you had acceptance from the church, ecclesiastical acceptance, overcoming opposition to distilled spirits, and allowing the monasteries to produce what was, in effect, to use the Latin, aqua vitae, literally the meaning of life. The water of life, meaning of life, the water of life. And that's probably a good opportune moment to talk about the origin of the word whiskey, where it comes from. Ushkavar, you can see highlighted here, that is Gaelic, okay, so ancient Scottish for the water of life. So that became shortened phonetically to Ushki, which in turn was anglicised to become whiskey. So that's where the word actually comes from. Your first recorded mention of whiskey in Scotland comes at the end of the 15th century, with left-hand top corner here, that is King James IV, or was King James IV, no less. And he granted a friar called John Core in Fife to turn what then would have been a sizable amount of barley, around half a ton, into 1,500 bottles of spirit. So quite a big order, even for them back in the day. So if you move on a bit forward to the early 16th century, making aqua vitae was really exclusively the right of what were called the surgeon barbers, or the sponsored bloodletters of their day, spirits perceived to possess medicinal properties. So any of you that have just staggered in from lunch, I apologise, but if you felt unwell, these guys back in the day would literally open you up to see what was wrong, hence the red and white in their coat of arms, the red blood spilling onto the white sheets. And it's the origin behind the colours on the barber's pole today. I'm not sure, forgive me if I'm making an assumption here, but those of you that are from the States, would you still mark a barber's or a hairdresser's with this red and white pole outside? Yeah, so that's the origin from the surgeon barber's coat of arms. That's where it comes from. So good old royalty, and my wife and I have just come from Grant Harold's fantastic talk about his uplift on the day with now King Charles III. But royalty gets involved again in the 16th century with Henry VIII falling out with not only his succession of wives, but also the church over his choice of consorts. And consequently, he took it out on the monks by literally sacking the monasteries, as you can see from the visuals here. So the monks were forced to spread themselves around the country, England, Scotland, whatever, teaching distilling as they went to help make themselves a living. So that's how they went about it. And the monks had learned to distill, but they turned to cereal crops and mainly barley, since, and again, you'll probably know this from today's a probably typical example. England, although, you know, viticulture has got better as the centuries have gone on now, and we do make some great sparkling wine back home. Some say as good as what the French do in Champagne. But of course, our climate in the UK is not the best for growing grapes, and back in the day, you know, it would have been crops and mainly barley that were grown in the country. Barley was an abundant food source in Scotland, and distilling was a convenient way to use up the excess crop harvest. And indeed, it was also used as a method of payment, probably between people, in exchange for other goods. So the stuff that was coming off the still, how did it taste? Well, it was rough. Nothing like what we've got today. It wasn't aged in barrels. It was literally drunk straight from the still. And they would have flavoured it with anything they could get their hands on. So berries, fruit, spices, you know, whatever. What you've got in this visual here was an important stage. You can see, obviously, we're still well back in medieval times here. But the introduction of copper pots led to a much more palatable product. Now, back in the day, copper was known to be a good heat conductor, because you obviously need heat for the whole process of distillation to make whiskey. It was easy to shape from a working point of view to put into stills. And they also discovered then, as indeed they still do to this day, if you go to a distillery and you see these copper pots, copper is vital in the whole process as stripping out some of the unwanted and indeed very distasteful products in the final spirit that you don't need. So copper came to the whiskey making story very early on. So if we now go on into the 17th century, but even today, I'm sure you'll agree with me wherever you're from, what happens if your government finds out you're enjoying something? They put a tax on it, don't they? Yeah, they put a levy on it. And in the middle of the 17th century, the Scottish Parliament, through Charles II here, they introduced the first levy on whiskey, which really upset the locals. That spread a lot of widespread anger. And almost the entire country actually turned to smuggling. The early 1700s, you had back home the Act of Union. That brought the Scottish and English parliaments together, and the imposition of a malt tax. Now, in the picture here, you've got these English excisemen, or the taxmen of the day, the gaugers as they became known. They were sent to collect the duties, which commonly led to an outbreak of violent confrontations, some bloody skirmishes, and more covert underground whiskey production, going underground, which you don't want. So just moving a little bit of a timeline slide here, reading from left to right. 1725, the malt tax was raised in Scotland to the English level, and that promoted further riots in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Thankfully, hope none of you saw any riots in Glasgow yesterday. I wonder if there's going to be anyone see the sort of potential riots in Belfast, the big protests that were going on. Yeah, I'm going to be brave now because my wife sat in the room. Like you, I'm on holiday as well, but I'm thinking, goodness me, I've come away on the ship and I can see loads of shouty women letting off steam. I can go home and listen to that. Sorry, love. That's my day ruined. Yeah, so further riots in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So here, the lowland distilleries, so we're now talking Glasgow, Edinburgh, the industrial belt, indeed, not far from where we were yesterday. The lowland distilleries were mixing malted barley now with unmalted grain in an effort to reduce the levy. Yeah? So the tax was on malted barley, not unmalted barley, which is pretty much what Irish pot still whiskey is. Those of you that might have gone to Jameson's and heard about, and indeed in the bars here next door, Redbreast, the spot drinks, this sort of thing, and why Jameson's actually, we're getting into whiskey itself now, but why Jameson's Irish whiskey tends to taste different than Scotch blends like Johnny Walker and Dewar's, which are on the ship. It's because of the pot still element made with a mixture of grain. So the Highland distilleries, they continued with malted barley, many producing illicitly to avoid payment. Now, with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in the middle here, the middle in the slide here, the timeline, 1780, the lowlands started to use these large-scale, shallow stills that you could see. They claimed to operate in 3 minutes to actually make spirit. The big pot stills, the copper pots that you see, that's a batch process. They will run for a few hours, they're cleaned out, then they start to make produce again. So this was a rapid turnover with significant tax benefits back in the day. But the spirit was extremely coarse, and it was monopolised by two families, the Steens and the Haigs, of which more about later on, and in my second talk later today. So 5 years later, 1784, you had the Wash Act introduced and a licence fee which was based on still capacity. Now, the Highland distillers were taxed less due to the recognised advantages of the lowland rivals with their turnover, but this started to encourage legal distilling, although smuggling was still rife. So, you've now got, at this stage, around about in the early 1800s then, 14,000 illicit stills being confiscated annually. And 50% of the Scotch whisky that was being consumed was without duty being paid. So this magnificently plumed gentleman was the 5th Duke of Gordon. And he made a proposition to the House of Lords, in England, your Parliament, the House of Lords, but in 1823, for legally made whisky to become profitable, okay? So you had an Excise Act which sanctioned the distilling of whisky. They agreed a licence fee, set an affordable payment of 2 shillings per gallon back in the day, which was an acceptable figure of proof spirit. And this really laid the foundations for the modern whisky industry. Smuggling died out and many distilleries opened on former illegal sites. I'm going to talk a little bit about Anais coffee. Did anyone go around Jameson's? Have I asked that question? Did you? Yeah? Okay. This chap might have been mentioned. I had the good fortune when we were in Cove not to go into Cork. When we're in Cove now, not in Dublin, but Middleton Distillery, where they're still making Jameson's today, where all the spirit's being made. And they mentioned this gentleman here, top left. looking a little bit like Lincoln back in the day, I guess, but Aeneas Coffey. Aeneas Coffey was an Inspector General of Excise in Ireland, so a taxman, boo. But he resigned his post in 1824, having seen the light, to run what was then known as the Dock Distillery in Dublin. And he improved on the patent still design, which is on the left-hand side here. This is a bit more chemistry. It's these two towers, if you like. The beer that you make, the wash, that was heated up in this right-hand column, and then it would go and meet steam coming the other way in the left-hand column to become a vapor, goes back into the right-hand column, and then gets condensed. So it's a continual process. And this was something then, what they call the rectifier on the right, the analyzer, the left-hand column. So again, a very efficient, continuous way of producing spirit. But this grain spirit was colourless, relatively characterless, and the majority was sold locally or sent to England for gin production. Now, importantly, although this was an Irish thing, that was coffee was Irish to produce the coffee still, this was actually snubbed locally by the Irish. They wanted to carry on making whiskey the same way, but it was embraced by the Scots, and that was a big thing with what then started to happen. Next couple of slides, moving on with how things unravelled, and that they were able to produce in large batches. So the merchants and innkeepers recognised that malt whisky, made the traditional way, that had a strong flavour which wasn't to everybody's tastes. So grain spirit required an added character, the stuff that was coming off these coffee stills. So the obvious conclusion was to blend, literally blend both types together to appeal to a wider range of consumers. So the gentleman top left, his name was Andrew Usher. I don't think Usher's whiskey is around anymore. It was on bottles, a tilt to history. But Usher was pretty much regarded as being the grandfather of blending. He pioneered it on a large scale, transformed the industry, and this actually led to a string of lowland distilleries, with the leading six forming the Distillers Company in 1865, which really was the forerunner to some of the big companies today. Again, apologies to those that have just had lunch, but this was a big thing because of what happened in the wine trade. Phylloxera vastatrix, which is easier for me to say at this time of day, having not had a drink, but I can say for simplification, known as the wine louse. Okay, this was a French wine catastrophe back in the day. They imported American vines unknowingly these were carrying a louse. Okay, now the American vines were immune to this louse, but not the French. So there was rapid spread throughout France. It devastated the cognac region, so brandy literally disappeared by 1880. And this was replaced by another brown spirit, that was whiskey. In the UK, that became fashionable. And that really signalled the boom period, okay? What became known as the whiskey merchants. And I'll be talking more about these guys in my second talk this afternoon that you can see on the bottles today. But the Scots were legally allowed to send whiskey to England in bottles, as opposed to kegs in barrels. And that gave them an opportunity for branding and merchants to promote. You also had improved communications with expanding railway network and steamships with access to the islands. It's interesting, bearing in mind the route that we're currently taking up around the top end of Scotland. So the merchants of the day, and I just mentioned these guys, as I said, they're going to be talking about more this afternoon. Top left, that is in fact John Walker, that went on to put his name to Johnny Walker Whiskey. Top right, looking like the old cigarette cards that used to come in the packs in the day, that was a gentleman called Peter Mackey, who basically was the man behind the White Horse blend, not so much in the UK now, but I think it's still available in certainly a big part of the States. Bottom left, this very dapper chap, Andrew Buchanan. He was behind a whiskey called Black and White. And then this magnificent mustachioed gentleman here, that's Tommy Dewar, or was Tommy Dewar. So Dewars, as I said in the ship here, he was a legendary salesman, but he was also very well known for many quotations. Okay, a bit like again, to tilt to our American friends in the room, W.C. Fields, some famous quotations. I've got two here for you, two great what became known as Dewarisms. So the first one: if we are here to help others, I often wonder what the others are here for. And I love this one, and hopefully this is a sop after what I said a few minutes ago, sweetheart. Don't question your wife's judgment. Look who she married. So it became fashionable to invest in whiskey. The banks were happy to lend money to finance the stock. New distilleries were being built, or existing ones expanded. There were more blenders and products. everything's going swimmingly and something had to go wrong. Yeah, everything's going fine, something had to go wrong. And so it did, right at the end of the 1800s. What became known as the Patterson's crash in 1898. The Patterson's was a large-scale blender and wholesaler based in Leith in Edinburgh, not really close to where we're going to be docking in a few days' time, or for the tender to go into Edinburgh for us. And that was founded by the two brothers, the Patterson's, Robert and Walter. Now, they became a limited company to raise capital and expand flotation based on a fraudulent balance sheet. The brothers led extravagant lifestyles. Again, just a quick story for you. No TV advertising back in the day. You've got to remember when this is. So I don't know what you're like when it comes to birds and wildlife and that sort of thing, but are you familiar with the intelligence of the African grey parrot? It's the easiest parrot, apparently it's the easiest parrot in the world to be able to teach to speak. Okay, so the Pattersons literally splashed out on 500 African grey parrots, brought them back to the UK with all of their shops and everything else, and trained these parrots to sit on a birch and say, "Bye, Pattersons. Pattersons is best." Yep. Fantastic advertising, something different, great memorability. That marching pipers up and down, you know how that gets related to Scotland, up and down their stores to you know, just to make people realise what they were doing. But confidence in the business waned because of what was going on behind the scenes. The share price fell with the collapse of the business. And indeed, they finished up being imprisoned for fraud for selling cheap, unnatured grain spirits, so hooch, rubbish, whatever you want to call it, as malt whiskey. And a recession followed with a decrease in the number of distilleries. Literally, there was 160. Numbers are picking back up in Scotland now, but 160. They lost about 30 distilleries overnight. So marching on, another timeline slide for you. We're getting nearly towards present times now, but the first quarter of the last century, that was a tough time for the whisky industry, as indeed it was for many people. Top left, David Lloyd George. He was the Chancellor in the UK at the stage, and eventually a Liberal Prime Minister. But he was a renowned teetotaler, and in 1909, he increased the duty by over a third to contribute towards pensions and unemployment benefit schemes. The outbreak of the First World War, that saw production and consumption cut. Licensed hours were shortened, and indeed the distilleries were regulated to produce alcohol and baker's yeast for the war effort. Now, following the Great War, depression saw closure of many distilleries, further taxation, but the American companies bought in to ensure market during Prohibition. You can't do a whiskey talk without talking about the Volstead Act and what happened in the US, obviously, but between 1920 and 1933. So Prohibition gave the Scots a real quandary. Yeah? Do they do nothing and watch the market ruined by cheap counterfeit whiskey, or break the US laws by selling direct? So the answer was to export to Canada. Got some Canadians in the room? Yeah, I know there's a few on the ship. So this is where the bootleggers of the day would sell to the US, okay? So this was considered a favour to US consumers, saving them from poor products made in these in American illicit stills. So there was a high demand for premium products. Maybe a difficult question. Anyone want to have a stab at who the guy in this picture is wearing the hat? No? Well, I'll tell you. He was really the famous bootlegger of his day. If any of you watched, and I enjoyed watching it in the UK, we had a series on HBO on satellite TV called Boardwalk Empire. Yeah? And one of the colourful characters in that was a guy called William McCoy, Bill McCoy. It's quite a nasty piece of work in the series. I have no idea what he was like in real life. I mean, he looks quite pleasant in this picture here. But Bill McCoy was the guy who really established a reputation for having the genuine article, the really good Irish stuff that was coming over, and Scottish stuff that was being bootlegged into Canada. Okay, so the word was, you know, what you're selling me, is that decent stuff? Yeah, it's the real McCoy. That's where it comes from. So you're coming here for a sleep after lunch this afternoon. The weather's not good outside. You're learning something, yeah, as we go along. Okay, so the real McCoy. So when Prohibition was repealed, many of the US companies and distributors, they were keen to buy up Scotch. And in the Second World War, there was a complete ban on grain distilling, but the malt distilling wasn't halted until 1942. So Winston Churchill, back home in the UK, he was an ally to the industry, the whiskey industry at the war's end. The Labour government imposed further taxes with cereals primarily used for food production. Grain rationing was actually finally lifted in 1953. And that signalled quite a lot of market expansion. Between the 50s and the 80s, You had a number of what they call mothballed distilleries that weren't being used, that were reopened, they were revived. New distilleries were being built. There was a lot of investment from North America and Canada. Seagram, classic example, Hiram Walker, Shenley, and indeed the distillery I've put in this picture, top left, Strathisla in Keith. That's the home of Chivas Regal, which I know is a very popular brand, and more about that in my second talk this afternoon back in the States. I know it's very popular. Wonderful distillery to visit. Very difficult on this trip. It's well inland in Speyside in Scotland. It's really not time to get there, but a lovely distillery to visit all the same. So in the 1980s, production methods increased with the advent of what they call drum maltings, literally these great big, almost like tumble dryers that could dry malt on a large scale to encourage larger production, improved heating systems for the stills. And in the 1980s, William Grant's whiskies on the ship, but William Grant saw a gap in the market, and they launched Glenfiddich. That was the first single malt, mainly for export, not at home, but mainly for export. And that proved very successful, which influenced a lot of other distilleries to follow suit. So what you had towards the end of the 90s then, and you can still see these in bars today, usual suspects, these 6 whiskies, all part of the Diageo stable now, the leading drinks company in the world. And I think I'm right in saying all of these brands, Lagavulin is getting difficult to get hold of at the minute because of demand, but all of these other brands you can find in the bars around the ship. But UDV, as they were then, United Distillers and Vintners, the forerunner of Diageo, they launched what became known as the classic malts range, seen in many bars today. So what you've got is differing tastes from classically the 6 Scottish whisky producing regions. On the left-hand side here, you've got Glenkinchie from the lowlands, Edinburgh, Glasgow, that sort of way. Very easy drinking. I would always say a breakfast whiskey. That sounds very habit-forming and dangerous. But it's a nice aperitif, before a meal. If you come across to the other side, the right-hand side, the stumpy bottle, Dalwhinnie, that's a particular favourite of mine. That was a representative from the Highlands. Cragganmore, right of centre from Speyside. Next to it, Oban, third bottle in on the left from the Isle of Oban. That's a representative from, one of 2 representatives from Island whiskies. 2 Island whiskies there. Talisker from the Isle of Skye, which again we've gone past not long today. And Lagavulin from Islay, which we would have sailed by last night, having rounded from Arran, to represent things on the smoky and peaty side. Not to everybody's taste, but those big smoky bonfire night whiskies that smell and taste like a spent match. As I say, a bit of an acquired taste can be a bit of a challenge for some people, but more on those in another talk. But this all helped to increase the awareness, choice, and demand for Scotch. So moving on, getting towards the end of my presentation now. But what followed was a period of consolidation in the industry, with a lot of closures and buyouts. You had overproduction, reduced demand. So DCL, they actually closed 12 distilleries in the mid-1980s. I put a couple of pictures here of 2 that are much missed, although fortunately, Diageo are now redesigning them and trying to produce spirit the way it used to be. The top picture there, Port Ellen on Islay. They still make, they still malt barley there for use on the island and the mainland now. But I'm glad to say this distillery has been revived. And the bottom one there, that is Brora Distillery, which is about an hour's train run from Invergordon. Wouldn't recommend it on Sunday. A, it's not going to be open. B, the trains are very haphazard on a Sunday, so don't even think about trying to get up there. But Brora, again, is another legendary whiskey that has now come out of being mothballed and is being rebuilt. Allied Distillers, this was a company which was a merger of Allied Lyons and Hiram Walker. Suntory from Japan, that I guess a lot of you will know, they took over a company called Morrison Bowmore in Scotland, and eventually the Macallan. And Diageo were formed over 25 years ago now, 1997, from a merger of Guinness and Grand Metropolitan. So the industry today, you currently have just over 140 distilleries in production. 130 or so of those are producing malt whiskey, and there's 9 of them producing grain spirit. Very, very important. It doesn't sound like it. These are the big chemistry sets I told you, with those coffee stills in. But when I tell you that 90 to 95% of the Scotch whisky industry today is blended whisky, and round about these blends are made up, 60 to 65% of them are bulked out with grain spirit. You need to be producing a lot of spirit, and that is why, and I just mentioned this, depending whereabouts in the ship you are, when we wake up in Invergordon, if you're looking out from the pontoon across to the land, you'll see the skyline dominated by a big white building with black rafters and black roofs, whatever, and you'll actually be able to to smell malt and evaporating alcohol as well. That is Invergordon Distillery, owned by a company called White and Mackay. For those of you that heard of White and Mackay, it's not a blend that's on the ship. Set up by two gentlemen who both died in their 50s of cirrhosis of the liver. Fair play to them. But as I said, they set up White and Mackay. But that's a distillery that which you'll see doesn't take visitors. And it's a Sunday. Don't even attempt to go banging on the door. Of those 140 so distilleries, though, multiple ownerships. You've got nearly 30 of them owned by Diageo. Other big players: Pernod Ricard, Bacardi, whatever. Now, the UK market is basically static, but you've got increased general demand around. A lot of it came from what they called the BRIC countries in the day. So Brazil, Russia, India, China. I think you can take Russia out of that mix now at the moment. The top blends, if we think about the market, closing things down towards the end now. So the top blends that are selling out there now, Johnny Walker is still the number one, but other makes include Ballantine's, other brands, Chivas Regal, and Grant's. And as far as the single malts are concerned, then, which is becoming more and more part of the market now, so you've got your Glenlivet's, Glenfiddich, the Macallan, Glenmorangie. Again, no surprises there, usual suspects. And again, if you're keen to try some of these, you'll find them on the ship. I've just put this in. Don't try and read some of the names, but you probably can't. Anyway, I just thought I'd put this in. It's last but one slide. This, bearing in mind where we are and what we're doing at the minute, and I'm not sure if my pointer's working properly. Yes, it is. Okay, fantastic. So we were down here, Greenock, weren't we? We sailed out of Greenock. So what we did, you've got some distilleries here. So just to say, we've been going for the last few hours or so and up until tomorrow through classic whiskey-making country as far as the Isles are concerned. We came past Arran last night with two distilleries on it, Arran and Lag. Campbellton here, this Mullikin as in the famous Paul McCartney and Wings song. 3 distilleries in Campbellton, right at the bottom there, Springbank, Glen Scotia and Glengyle. And then we rounded Islay, I know in the early hours, this legendary whiskey-making island where all the smoky stuff comes from. 9 distilleries there, including the Freud, which is on the ship. And then moving on, we've come up here, we came past Mull, which is the home of Tobermory. Skye, which has got Talisker, that a lot of you know, but also a new distillery that's now producing spirit called Torrevieja. That's worth seeking out. Again, if you like your peaty whiskies. There are now 2 distilleries on Lewis, on Harris and Lewis. You have... not very imaginative, but actually called the Isle of Harris Distillery, and another one named Affan Cheg, which is Gaelic for the Red River. That's on Lewis. And of course, I think we're round about here at the minute, but we will be passing, obviously past just below the Orkneys, which is the home to 2 distilleries, Scapa, which some people don't know. They know it historically, obviously because of the naval traditions. But Highland Park, again, a real big seller, and again, a big favourite, really good single malt. Pretty sure that's on the ship as well. That's on Orkney. And then, of course, tomorrow we get into to Invergordon, okay, which is, come on, round about this sort of region here. As I said, it's a Sunday. Still a lot of religious things going on in Scotland, so they don't open on a Sunday. But that's the home to a couple of distilleries in particular called Dalmore and Balblair, if you've heard of them. The big famous one is Glenmorangie. I checked before we came away. I know in terms of visiting at the minute, Glenmorangie is only starting to open for visitors from the beginning of June, so we're a little bit early. Having said that, I don't know if some of you want a trip going to Dunrobin Castle or somewhere like that. If Glenmorangie's on the manifest, maybe they're opening for the ship, but no promises there. But I just thought, as I said, I dropped that one in, basically just to show you that we have been sailing past Whiskeyland during the night and during today. So I hope that's given you a bit of a thirst to explore. You don't feel so intimidated going into a shop or checking around the bars on the ship, but you'll know that your sommeliers and the bar staff, they're all here to help you. So if you want to go out and try something different, you'll know. I'm obviously talking about Scotch today. That's the focus given the itinerary that we've got. I have nothing against bourbon and Canadian whiskey, ladies and gentlemen. It's a magnificent drink, but obviously my brief on here is to talk to you about Scotch and later on some Irish whiskey as well. So I'd like to say thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm back on at 4 o'clock when I'll be talking more about some of those names that are up there, the whiskey barons that have shaped the industry into what it is today. Hope to see some of you later on. If not, I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon on board and holiday on this lovely ship. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.